Following the end of World War II, things got pretty shaky for Sikorsky Aircraft. The company had just been revived back in 1943. With the fighting over, military orders dropped practically to zero. Just look at the numbers. They built 144 helicopters in 1944. Then they built 275 in 1945. However, by early 1946, the production line in Bridgeport had almost completely ground to a halt. The company desperately needed a bold move. Igor Sikorsky needed a new breakthrough. He needed a revolutionary aircraft that could save the day, just like his highly successful S-38 flying boat had done years before. Sikorsky models like the S-47, S-48, and S-49 found plenty of military applications. They were genuinely indispensable in these roles. Despite this, top brass in the United States military were still hesitant. They were not sure if it was worth spending their already tight post-war budgets on such strange and novel aircraft. On top of that, the performance specs of these early helicopters were far from ideal. Their payload and speed left a lot to be desired, which certainly did not help with mass sales. A similar situation played out in the civilian market. Ad campaigns were pitching rotorcraft left and right for all sorts of peacetime jobs. However, commercial buyers were in no rush to hand over their cash for these unusual machines. After all, helicopters cost more than conventional airplanes. They were significantly harder to fly, maintaining them took a serious amount of effort, and frankly, the overall reliability of these early models was still pretty poor. In addition to the financial trouble, by the mid-1940s, Igor Sikorsky found himself facing some very serious competition. Interestingly enough, he was partly a victim of his own success. High-profile demonstration flights drew a massive amount of attention from other engineers and entrepreneurs. There was also a constant stream of news about the successes of his helicopters. According to the well-known American aircraft designer Arthur Young, more than 340 different companies popped up in the United States around that time. They were all trying to build similar rotorcraft. This new branch of aviation seemed incredibly promising. At first glance, it offered massive profits. Enthusiasts were designing and building rotorcraft in the most bizarre shapes and sizes. For example, companies like Platt Lepage and Landgraf were busy testing experimental helicopters. These featured a transverse rotor layout, which designers planned to use as the basis for true heavy-lift cargo helicopters. Meanwhile, over at McDonnell, engineer Konstantin Zakharchenko started developing a transverse rotor aircraft in 1944. It was intended to compete in a special United States Navy design competition. The goal was to create a heavy rescue helicopter. At the same time, Kellett Aircraft already had solid experience building autogyros. In the early 1940s, they set to work on a syncropter. This was a helicopter with intermeshing main rotors. A little while later, the Cayman brothers also began developing a similar system. A lot of inventors back then went with a coaxial rotor setup. However, the vast majority still preferred the classic single-main rotor design. Pretty soon, the biggest rivals to Sikorsky turned out to be a group of talented engineers. This included Arthur Young, Stanley Hiller, tandem rotor advocate Frank Piasecki, and the aforementioned Cayman brothers. Bell designer Arthur Young was long fascinated by rotary wing flight. He was inspired by Sikorsky's immense success to create the classic single-rotor Bell 30. Through a few innovative engineering choices, he dramatically simplified the helicopter's design. This made it significantly easier to fly. In 1946, the highly successful two-seat Bell 47 was developed directly from this aircraft. It was at this point that the company's driven founder, Larry Bell, finally edged out Igor Sikorsky. In March 1946, the Bell 47 became the first helicopter in history to receive a civil airworthiness certificate. The irony was that the certification rules themselves were actually written based on the flight experience of Sikorsky's early helicopters. The Bell 47 remained the undisputed leader in its class well into the late 1960s. Across multiple variants, it was manufactured both in the United States and overseas until relatively recently. This set an incredible record for longevity in aviation. Arthur Young's brilliant engineering mind and Larry Bell's flawless business instincts cemented their company as Sikorsky's main rival in the light helicopter market. But back in the 1940s, this rival faced its fair share of struggles too. For instance, Larry Bell was so confident of immediate success that he decided to flood the market with a production run of 500 Bell 47s. The reality was harsh. Over 400 of them ended up sitting unsold in warehouses because the buyers simply weren't there. To capture the market and beat the competition, Sikorsky rolled out a new helicopter in February 1946. It was the S-51. The story behind its creation is fascinating and quite telling. When the Second World War ended, the military canceled its remaining contracts. This left the company with enough components sitting in warehouses to build at least 35 two-seat S-48 military helicopters, with zero hope that the Army was going to buy them. On top of that, the few potential civilian buyers were highly skeptical of a specialized military aircraft with a cramped cockpit. That's when Igor Sikorsky came up with a brilliant idea. He decided to take the engine, transmission, rotors, and other dynamic components from this model and design a completely new, more spacious fuselage around them. This approach would vastly expand the aircraft's utility in peacetime. Better yet, using proven off-the-shelf components not only made the development process cheaper and faster, but also kept the final price tag highly attractive to future buyers. The company kicked off this major redesign in October 1945. To attract customers and highlight the helicopter's simplicity, Sikorsky's marketing team claimed the engineers had only swapped out the cabin. In reality, the modifications were far more extensive. The days when a new aircraft could be pieced together like a model kit from leftover spare parts were long gone. The S-51 ended up being an entirely new helicopter rather than just a heavily modified version of its predecessor. That's exactly why it was given a new designation. The helicopter, on which the company had pinned enormous hopes, made its first flight on February 16, 1946. It was flown by the company's chief pilot, Dmitry Wiener. He was Sikorsky's nephew and had actually helped him build the S-29A airplane back when he was just a teenager. As we touched on earlier, the first thing the engineers tackled was the cabin. Instead of a cramped two-seater, it was transformed into a comfortable four-seat layout. The pilot now sat up front. Right behind him, along the bulkhead separating the cabin from the engine compartment, they installed a 3-passenger bench seat. The overall comfort of the helicopter was a huge step up. For example, to keep all that glass from fogging up in flight, warm air was blown across the windshields. This air came from a dedicated combustion heater tucked right under the floor. To route that heat properly, though, they had to split the massive windshield into several sections using structural frames. They put the pilot's door on the right and added a handy sliding door on the left side for the passengers. Because the cabin got wider, the design team had to completely rework the center fuselage, and eventually the tail boom as well. Visually, the new airframe looked noticeably bulkier. They swapped out the old skin for lightweight, durable aluminum. The tail section was also built entirely out of aircraft-grade alloys. This change made the whole airframe much more robust. By that time, the American aviation industry had figured out how to manufacture complex rotor head components. These new parts were put to use on the new S-51. The main rotor diameter also increased from 48 to 49 feet. By the 1950s, the company had developed all metal blades for both the main and tail rotors on this model. On top of that, they started fitting some of these helicopters with significantly larger diameter tail rotors. All these technical upgrades dramatically improved the helicopter's reliability and extended its service life. Thanks to that, the aircraft quickly became popular and saw widespread use. Beyond the exterior changes, the S-51 got a radically redesigned flight control system. Igor Sikorsky always paid close attention to how his aircraft handled. He did everything he could to reduce pilot workload. His goal was to make flying as smooth and effortless as possible. That is why, heading into the 1950s, they tested several different stabilization systems on this helicopter. They installed an experimental automatic stabilization system for the first time, and eventually equipped it with a full autopilot. Around that same time, Sikorsky introduced updated landing gear for the new helicopter. It still featured a tricycle gear layout. However, the designers shifted the main gear slightly aft to improve the center of gravity. The cast-ring nose wheel was tucked into a neat, riveted fairing. Interestingly, just like the earlier S-48 model, it was designed to be fitted with floats for water landings. These looked like two giant hot dogs that attached right over the standard wheels. However, those massive floats created way too much aerodynamic drag in flight. So, the engineers later came up with a much more elegant solution. They replaced them with specialized emergency flotation collars. These collars were mounted directly to the landing gear struts. In the event of a water emergency, they would rapidly inflate. They expanded into large flotation collars, doing a great job of keeping the aircraft stable and afloat on calm water. That said, early versions of the S-51 had one major flaw. They were missing a protective skid on the tail boom. Because of this, if a pilot flared too steeply on landing, it could easily result in a tail rotor strike. Fortunately, Sikorsky fixed this issue on later models. Ultimately, the S-51 became a true multi-role workhorse. Sure, it was more expensive to build and maintain than its main rival, the Bell 47, but it more than made up for it with a much higher payload capacity and a spacious cabin. Parked side by side, the S-51 looked like a luxury limo next to a bare-bones Jeep. Thanks to these advantages, Sikorsky's design quickly found its footing in the commercial market. It steadily edged out its nimble competitor from Texas. The real secret to the success of the S-51 was the invaluable experience the engineering team gained from earlier projects. For instance, engineers used a proven method to prevent destructive ground resonance. This significantly reduced vibration levels in the cockpit. Plus, they finally had the resources to run extensive fatigue tests on the main rotor blades. In 1946, the company built a dedicated main rotor test stand. It spun the blades up with a high-powered electric motor. This exact rig was used to perfect the rotor systems for the S-51. It also helped perfect many of the helicopters that followed. This rigorous endurance testing allowed them to maximize the reliability of all key dynamic components. By conducting an in-depth analysis of vibration sources, designers managed to reduce them to an absolute minimum. All of this drastically improved both the handling and the overall ride quality. The helicopter received its official civil certification in 1947. But commercial operators were so eager to use it that flights began much earlier. As early as July 1946, surplus military S-48s were already flying airmail routes over Los Angeles. By August, they were joined by the new S-51s. These gradually phased out their predecessors. The new aircraft quickly gained traction nationwide. That fall, specifically in October 1946, a landmark event took place. 3 S-51s established a direct air route. This connected the Chicago airport with the downtown business district and the surrounding suburbs. That same year, helicopter air transport was founded in Philadelphia. They banked heavily on on-demand charter flights with a fleet of 4 S-51s. 3 of these helicopters soon made a name for themselves in an unusual promotional stunt. A large retail firm out of Hartford decided to celebrate its centennial. They did this by air, delivering purchases to customers across 66 towns in Connecticut. Around the same time, another revolutionary initiative took off. This was the first scheduled helicopter airmail route in the world, set up by Los Angeles Airways. A fleet of 8 S-48 and S-51 helicopters was flown hard. Operating 6 days a week on a grueling schedule, they flew between 29 different communities across Southern California. Every single day, these workhorses logged 13 flight hours and made around 110 landings. The results were staggering. Compared to traditional ground transport, the helicopter airmail service saved anywhere from 4 to 19 hours of transit time. Watching this runaway success, Igor Sikorsky was finally convinced. The time for full-scale commercial passenger flights had arrived. This was especially true for shuttle routes. These were designed to quickly connect downtown centers with outlying airports, bypassing ground traffic entirely. In 1947, British European Airways made a bold move. They set up an experimental helicopter unit by acquiring 3 S-51s. For 2 years, these rotorcraft delivered mail day and night across eastern England. Those winter night missions in 1948 became the first true IFR flights in history. This is why these S-51s were specially equipped with the latest navigation gear. Back in 1950, that same airline became the first in the world to launch scheduled passenger helicopter flights. Initially connecting Liverpool, Cardiff, and Wrexham, the routes later expanded to include major hub airports. By 1954, passengers could catch regular flights between London Heathrow Airport and the heart of the capital. But the career of the S-51 was just getting started. It quickly became a true utility aircraft. They flew as air ambulances and dusted crops for farmers. They also flew search and rescue missions, served with police and customs, and patrolled vast areas. The sheer scale of their versatility was incredible. Down in Argentina, just 16 S-51s saved the country from a catastrophic locust plague. In South Africa, they wiped out deadly tsetse flies. And across Australia, they battled bark beetle infestations. Crews used these helicopters to take detailed aerial photographs, map out terrain, and fly ice reconnaissance missions. They patrolled thousands of miles of gas and oil pipelines, monitored vast forests, and even helped commercial fishermen spot massive schools of fish. The S-51 also earned a reputation in law enforcement. American police departments were the first to realize that a helicopter was the perfect tool for traffic control and tracking fleeing suspects. It is no exaggeration to say that the S-51, right alongside the Bell 47, truly kick-started the widespread civilian use of helicopters. The massive success of the civilian S-51 did not go unnoticed by the military. The assembly lines at the Bridgeport plant were soon running at full capacity once again. The U.S. Army Air Forces bought an initial batch of 11 S-51s. In military service, they were designated as the R-5 and later the H-5. The Army used them to medevac casualties, maintain communications, fly aerial reconnaissance, and act as artillery spotters. Combat engineers quickly figured out that a helicopter made it incredibly easy to set up river crossings, string communication wire, and lay down pipelines. The following year, helicopter procurement ramped up even more. This happened right as the Air Branch finally split from the Army to become an independent branch of the armed forces. They became the United States Air Force. Along with this reorganization, the Air Force set up a dedicated air rescue service. These units quickly deployed all over the globe. Their primary tool for the job was none other than the helicopters designed by Igor Sikorsky. This fulfilled the lifelong dream of the brilliant aircraft designer. Sikorsky had always believed that the true calling of the helicopter was saving lives rather than bringing about destruction. Thanks to his helicopters, the most capable rescue system in the world was established and truly found its footing. Of course, the rapid growth of this service was heavily driven by real, often incredible rescue stories. These missions looked like spectacular Hollywood stunts, except they were being pulled off in real life without a safety net. Highly skilled pilots were out there proving firsthand exactly what these amazing aircraft could do. Here is just one of those incredible cases. In December 1947, a C-54 transport crashed on the snow-covered Labrador Peninsula, not far from Goose Bay. Search and rescue crews down at Westover Field in Massachusetts were immediately scrambled. They quickly prepped a large C-82 transport, loaded a partially disassembled R-5 helicopter into its spacious cargo hold, and rushed it north to Labrador. The entire complex logistical operation took less than 24 hours to pull off. On December 11th, Lieutenant Thomas Tipton lifted off in the newly assembled helicopter. He flew into the freezing air and headed out on the search. With him on board was Lieutenant Samuel Weir, a flight medic ready to provide immediate first aid. They managed to spot the crash site by following a grim trail of sheared-off treetops. Tipton masterfully set his R-5 down right on the ice of a small frozen lake near the wreckage. A medical team was quickly flown in. Then, using 2 R-5s, all the casualties were successfully evacuated to a hospital. Every single survivor made it out. They owed their rescue entirely to this amazing aircraft. In 1948, the United States Air Force ordered 39 H-5G helicopters. They featured an interesting quirk. Rescue hoists were mounted on the left side. These helicopters could carry up to 4 litters for casualties. They could also carry 2 specialized enclosed medical capsules mounted externally. Later on, 16 more helicopters of the H-5H variant rolled off the line. They were equipped with much more powerful hoists and amphibious floats. These floats featured distinctive hot dog-shaped pontoons. On top of that, these choppers were fitted with 2 built-in casualty capsules integrated crosswise into the fuselage. One was forward of the center section and one was aft. The flight medic sat in the cabin next to the pilot. However, they could only tend to the patient in the forward capsule during flight. Because of this design flaw, pilots grimly nicknamed the rear capsule the dead man's pod. Thanks to all these additions, the helicopter's gross weight climbed to almost 6,600 pounds. Naturally, the flight performance of such an overloaded aircraft took a noticeable hit. Pilots joked that its remaining payload capacity was only enough to haul verbal orders. Even before the Air Force stepped in, the Navy took a serious interest in the S-51. The Navy needed an aircraft like this primarily for search and rescue operations. The historic first-ever rescue of a person at sea by helicopter took place on November 28, 1945. A severe storm had rolled in that day. A barge tore loose from mooring. The unforgiving sea pushed it out into open water. The vessel was barely staying afloat. The two men trapped on board had been stranded. They had been waiting in vain for help for 16 hours. Their hopes for rescue were fading by the minute. Luckily, someone had the bright idea to call the Sikorsky Aircraft plant directly down in Bridgeport. The incident happened close by. Because of this, the company's chief pilot, Dmitry Viner, immediately took off in an R-5A helicopter. Despite the gale force winds and heavy rain, he managed to reach the barge. The pilot masterfully hovered over the vessel. He lowered a cable using the hoist and winched the first sailor right up into the cabin. Not wanting to waste precious time, he delivered the second man to shore. The man was dangling right from the hoist cable. Following this incredible success, the Navy placed its first order for S-51 helicopters in late 1946. 4 of these Navy choppers joined a massive Antarctic expedition. This expedition was led by the famous polar explorer, Rear Admiral Richard Byrd. They were based on the icebreaker Northwind. They performed absolutely brilliantly as shipboard helicopters for ice reconnaissance and scouting. Operating aircraft off carriers back then was incredibly dangerous. Crews frequently ended up in the cold water instead of on the flight deck. This could happen from a minor pilot error or a sudden mechanical failure during launch or recovery. When that happened, their only hope for rescue was the plane guard destroyers escorting the carrier. Early experience with the Navy's version of the R-4 helicopter proved something important. It showed that using rotorcraft for water rescues was highly practical. Dmitry Viner was the first to demonstrate these unique capabilities under real operational conditions. In 1947, during large-scale fleet maneuvers, he and a factory Sikorsky S-51 helicopter were stationed aboard the aircraft carrier USS Franklin D. Roosevelt. One day, while on approach, Lieutenant Colonel Stabline's 2-seat aircraft drifted off centerline. It missed the deck entirely and slammed into the sea at high speed. The aircraft stayed afloat for just a few moments before slipping beneath the surface. This happened to the absolute horror of everyone watching. But moments later, stunned sailors saw the pilot break the surface. He was clearly injured, disoriented, and thrashing helplessly in the waves. His life vest had failed to inflate. Viner and a Navy observer, Lieutenant Rallo, were on deck at the time and instantly sprinted to the helicopter. Viner got the chopper airborne in a flash. He held the S-51 in a precise hover right next to the exhausted pilot, with the landing gear literally touching the water. Lieutenant Rallo threw him a rescue line. Stabline barely managed to grab it with his last ounce of strength. By the time they pulled the injured pilot up into the cabin, he had already passed out. To make sure no one else was in the water, the crew made one more pass over the crash site. Sadly, there was no sign of the second crew member on the surface, so the helicopter immediately headed back to the carrier. If it had not been for the helicopter's quick response, the plane guard destroyer simply would not have reached him in time. Over just 10 days of that cruise, Dmitry Viner managed to rescue 6 people from the water. In one instance, he hoisted a downed pilot out just 2 minutes after the crash. The guy barely had time to realize what happened. Another time, he rapidly recovered a sailor who had been accidentally blown overboard by rotor wash, and he did it before anyone on the flight deck even realized the man was missing. After this impressive performance, the Navy introduced a new standard procedure. During flight operations, a helicopter had to fly plane guard alongside the carrier. The crew of this rotary wing guardian angel usually consisted of 2 people, a pilot and a rescue swimmer. They were ready at a moment's notice to ride the hoist down into the water to provide emergency assistance. Overall, the U.S. Navy received 91 HO-3S-1 helicopters. Most of these aircraft were immediately fitted with rescue hoists. Some units even received emergency flotation gear for over-water operations. Navy researchers ran a number of fascinating experiments using the S-51 model, For instance, engineers tried adapting these rotorcraft for night operations. There are still some incredible photographs from that era. They show the night sky streaked with light trails from the position lights mounted on the HO-3S1's rotor tips. In 1949, these helicopters were heavily involved in testing the first airborne dipping sonar, the AQS-1. This took place at Naval Air Station Key West in Florida. The Navy did not keep this new technology to itself. They transferred 9 of these rotorcraft each to the Coast Guard and the Marine Corps. In December 1947, the first Marine Corps helicopter squadron in history was formed, HMX-1. Exactly a year later, they received their first HO-3S1s. The goal was not only to replace light reconnaissance and liaison aircraft, it was also to enable rapid troop insertion behind enemy lines. This concept opened up entirely new tactical possibilities. It added a true vertical dimension to battlefield operations. During the spring exercises in 1948, HMX-1 clearly demonstrated the massive potential of helicopters as assault transports. And soon after, the S-51 would have to prove itself in combat. The ultimate test for the entire helicopter industry, and especially for Sikorsky, was the Korean War. In June 1950, fighting broke out on the peninsula. It became the bloodiest conflict since the end of World War II. When the war began, the U.S. military had 161 S-51 helicopters in its inventory. Another 53 were operating commercially. The vast majority of the military helicopters were assigned to Air Force rescue squadrons. During the early stages of the war, S-51s were the only helicopters operating in the skies over Korea. The 3rd Air Rescue Squadron was based in Tokyo at the time. However, by June, 2 of its H-5 helicopters were deployed directly into the combat zone. They were soon joined by Marine Corps and Navy HO-3S1s. From then until the end of the conflict, Sikorsky's helicopters became the thin line between life and death. They were often the only chance of rescue for thousands of American and Allied troops facing capture. The rugged, mountainous terrain, unpredictable weather, lack of accurate maps, and an extremely poor road network created a logistical nightmare for the military. Add to that an enemy force that often outnumbered them, infiltrated rear areas, and frequently left American units surrounded and cut off. All of this meant the troops had a critical need for reliable transport and liaison aircraft that did not require prepared airstrips. And that was exactly when military strategists who had viewed rotorcraft with outright skepticism just a short time prior quickly became their strongest advocates. In September 1950, the Commandant of the United States Marine Corps, General Lemuel C. Shepard, put it this way: "Here in Korea, helicopters are viewed with exceptional favor and gratitude. No matter who you ask, every single Marine will be sure to tell you a story that highlights their critically important role on the battlefield. Aerial reconnaissance, liaison support, visual observation of the flanks, rapidly repositioning patrols between strategic points, delivering mail, and providing vital supplies to forward positions. These are just some of the missions they handle brilliantly. There is absolutely no doubt that all these glowing reviews are fully justified. We must make every possible effort to send as many HO-3S helicopters to the front lines as we can. And if possible, we should send even larger helicopters, giving them absolute priority over the delivery of any other type of weapon system." The demand for the S-51 in Korea was so massive that mechanics were converting them from standard observation aircraft into dedicated medevac choppers. This was done right out on the flight line under harsh field conditions. It is pretty rare in military history for a fundamentally new piece of hardware to serve from the very beginning not to deal destruction, but to save lives. In fact, helicopters kicked off their large-scale combat service by pulling severely wounded troops right off the battlefield. The very first helicopter rescue took place in July 1950, just a month after the fighting broke out. That first mission was flown by crews from the Air Force 3rd Air Rescue Squadron in a relatively permissive environment without taking direct enemy fire. But the distinction of flying the first true combat rescue mission under enemy fire belongs to the helicopter pilots of the Marine Corps. The first 4 Marine Corps HO-3S1 helicopters arrived at the port of Busan on August 2, 1950. The very next day, they took to the skies to scout enemy positions. Just 2 days later, the crews accomplished something incredible. They evacuated 5 severely wounded Marines from the battlefield. 3 of them had to be picked up from steep hillsides that standard military jeeps simply could not reach. This soon became standard operating procedure, and wounded troops were airlifted directly to medical battalions. Interestingly enough, the troops on the ground were pretty skeptical of these unusual aircraft at first. Because of their strange appearance and the rhythmic thwack of their blades, the troops jokingly nicknamed them flying egg beaters. But that skepticism quickly turned into genuine gratitude, and the helicopters earned a much warmer nickname, Guardian Angels. According to the memoirs of one American general, the statistics prior to the Korean War were grim. Troops who suffered moderate to severe battlefield wounds had an 80 to 90% mortality rate. However, with the arrival of rotary-wing aircraft, the situation completely turned around. That mortality rate plummeted to just 10%. During the conflict, a unique but noble rivalry developed between helicopter crews from different branches of the United States military. They continually proved their courage and skill when it came to saving lives. Just 2 days after a major success by the Marine Corps, Air Force rescue crews also distinguished themselves. An H-5 helicopter crew executed a grueling medevac of several severely wounded soldiers right off a mountaintop. The peak sat at an altitude of nearly 5,000 feet. To make matters worse, it was completely surrounded by North Korean troops. Following the successful operation on August 6th, the Pentagon made a strategic decision. Going forward, every infantry division was required to have its own helicopter detachment. The very next day, the commander of the United States Air Force in Korea, Major General Earl Partridge, issued a formal directive. It stated that the primary mission of helicopters would be the search and rescue of wounded personnel, as well as troops cut off behind enemy lines. For the United States military, the legendary S-51 helicopter became more than just a ray of hope. It was a psychological lifeline. Knowing that if things went south, a rescue chopper would absolutely fly in and pull you out of hell completely changed the mindset of the troops. With that safety net, every pilot and infantryman went into battle with renewed confidence and grit. During the war, a major emphasis was placed on combat search and rescue for aviators, whose aircraft were shot down over hostile territory. To support this, a compact portable radio beacon was added to the standard emergency survival kit for United States air crews. It broadcast their exact location, acting as a homing signal for search aircraft. Typically, the rescue procedure worked like this. An orbiting aircraft would pick up the distress beacon first. It would act as the on-scene commander and vector the rescue helicopter to the target. Along with the electronics, the survival kit also packed a standard issue signal mirror. A downed pilot could use it to catch the sunlight, visually marking their position on the ground for the incoming crew. If an aircraft went down over the ocean and the crew had to ditch, they were not left helpless either. Their kits included an inflatable life raft with a small sail and a sea dye marker to create a highly visible target in the water from the air. Shark repellent and plenty of other survival essentials were packed as well. The most hazardous search and rescue sorties for downed aviators were largely handled by crews from dedicated air rescue squadrons of the United States Air Force. Their operating conditions were incredibly grueling. The shift of a rescue crew in Korea often lasted 18 hours straight without a single break. And these crews did not just operate along the front lines, they frequently penetrated deep into hostile territory, covering distances of over 120 miles. Typically, a pilot did not fly these high-risk sorties alone. A qualified flight medic was always on board. Their job was not just to provide immediate trauma care on the spot. If necessary, they had to grab a weapon and defend their patient from enemy forces. A prime example of this kind of daring operation was a mission flown by Pilot Lieutenant David McDonnell and Flight Medic Captain David Shoemate. In their unarmed H-5 helicopter, they pushed deep behind enemy lines. They rescued the stranded pilot of a downed British aircraft and successfully made it back to base. It took the rescuers a solid 2 hours to reach the crash site under constant enemy ground fire. The pilot, Shoemate, had to pull the unconscious British aviator from the mangled wreckage himself. He then crawled back to his helicopter, dragging the aviator while firing his sidearm to hold off a North Korean patrol that had just arrived on the scene. Once back aboard the H-5, the crew started a blood transfusion for the rescued man. He was flown directly to a hospital ship. Doctors there were already prepped for emergency surgery. The British pilot survived. the helicopter crew received top honors from both the United States and Great Britain. The Allies rarely held back decorations for those who risked their lives to rescue fellow troops. U.S. Navy pilots flying HO-3S-1 helicopters were also heavily involved in major combat operations in Korea. They launched from American ships operating off the Korean peninsula. Their primary mission was rescuing aviators shot down over the water or along the coast. They also medevaced wounded troops from the mainland. They flew them out to hospital ships waiting offshore. On top of that, these Navy S-51s flew countless other vital missions. They spotted naval gunfire and scouted for naval mines. They also flew plane guard during carrier flight operations and rescued sailors from sinking vessels. Until early December 1950, the burden fell squarely on these early rescue crews. This was before utility helicopters like the Bell 47 arrived in theater in large numbers. Later arrivals included the Sikorsky S-52, S-55, and Hiller 12. A single Marine Corps squadron flying just 4 HO-3S-1s racked up over 1,600 flight hours. In that time, they flew 1,500 combat sorties. This included dozens of recon flights and hundreds of transport runs. They also flew countless medevacs for wounded troops and personnel trapped behind enemy lines. Crews regularly flew search and rescue for downed pilots. They also provided critical communication links between units. Those 4 helicopters alone pulled more than 300 people from near certain death. Meanwhile, Army rescue crews in their dependable H-5s were putting up incredible numbers of their own. They flew over 1,200 successful sorties. They airlifted more than 700 service members to safety. Overall, by the end of 1950, S-51s had helped save over 1,200 lives. Company newsletters at Sikorsky Aircraft and United Aircraft Corporation published updated statistics on their front pages almost daily. They were likely the only American publications during that era keeping a tally of lives saved rather than enemies killed. The prestigious roster of the Sikorsky Rescue Club grew day by day throughout the Korean War. Newer helicopters from Sikorsky, Bell, and Hiller started arriving in theater in large numbers. However, it did not diminish the role of the veteran S-51s. They continued to perform flawlessly in the most demanding rescue operations. 6 HO-3S-1s especially made a name for themselves during the freezing winter of 1951. This was when massive Chinese forces laid siege to Seoul. Under the brutal conditions of the siege, these helicopters became an absolute lifeline. They delivered food, ammo, and critical medical supplies to the cut-off garrison. They evacuated the severely wounded on the return trip. By the end of the war, just one squadron of carrier-based HO-3S-1s had flown 450 rescue missions. Because of that incredible dedication, 4 of their pilots were awarded the second highest decoration for valor from the Navy. They received the Navy Cross. One incredible example took place in 1951. Over 100 sailors from a sunken ship found themselves stranded deep behind North Korean lines. Navy HO-3S-1s rushed to the scene. They extracted the men so fast that the stunned enemy troops did not even have time to react or mount a defense. Altogether, throughout the entire war, the helicopters of Igor Sikorsky rescued more than 10,000 people. Despite seeing such intense combat use, the loss rate for the S-51s remained surprisingly low. The aircraft proved to be incredibly rugged and reliable, regularly taking heavy fire from enemy anti-aircraft guns and small arms. There is even one bizarre incident where a helicopter sustained damage from an anti-tank mine. This was triggered entirely by the powerful downwash of its own main rotor. The enemy constantly set up clever ambushes at potential landing zones, trying to catch the rescue crews off guard with surprise mortar fire. But the nimble choppers proved to be so agile that they easily evaded attacks, even from high-speed Soviet MiG jet fighters. Frontline legends are still told today about these wild aerial duels and extremely dangerous encounters. In one instance, a Navy HO-3S-1 miraculously survived attacks from 3 Soviet MiG-15 fighters. It did this by skillfully masking itself in the terrain and maneuvering through the hills. Another HO-3S-1 was flying with a punctured rotor blade. It spent a harrowing 75 miles evading a pursuing MiG that never managed to shoot it down. Attempts by the North Korean military to intercept these rotary wing aircraft using slow Po-2 biplanes also proved completely ineffective. At the same time, the crews of the American S-51s were far from defenseless. They actively used personal weapons and dropped small bombs to lay down suppressing fire during rescue missions. In fact, these were some of the very first instances in history where rotary wing aircraft were used directly for offensive strike operations. Naturally, the enemy quickly noticed the success of Sikorsky's design. Capturing an intact S-51 became a top priority for the Soviet Air Force. The Soviet Search and Rescue Service, which was just starting to take shape back then, was especially interested. Its leadership desperately wanted to study advanced American rotorcraft technology. To hunt down a Sikorsky helicopter, Soviet and Chinese forces orchestrated an elaborate trap. Chinese soldiers pinpointed the exact crash site where a downed American fighter pilot had landed. He immediately sent out a distress signal. Knowing full well the American military ethos of never leaving a man behind, the Chinese quietly surrounded the pilot. When the rescue HO-3S1 flew in for the pickup, they sprang their ambush. The helicopter pilot tried to aggressively power out of the zone. However, dozens of soldiers had already grabbed onto the landing gear and the rescue ladder. The aircraft started pitching violently. A main rotor blade struck the brush, and the S-51 suffered a dynamic rollover. The trap had worked. The captured helicopter was quickly shipped off to Moscow. Initially, Soviet leadership planned to repair the main rotor blades and test fly it. However, they decided to start by just studying the HO-3S1 at the Soviet TSAGI Institute. There, they stripped the helicopter down to its smallest components, carefully examining and weighing every single part. Researchers compared them to components from their own Mi-1 and Yak-100 helicopters, and found Sikorsky's design to be significantly lighter. This gave Soviet engineers fresh ideas for improving their own designs. Unfortunately, almost none of this knowledge was applied to developing a dedicated search and rescue force in the Soviet Union. Reflecting on the performance of the S-51 during the Korean War, Commander of Naval Forces Far East, Vice Admiral Charles Turner Joy, made a profound statement. He stated that no other type of Navy and Marine Corps aircraft has demonstrated its outstanding qualities on the battlefield so highly as the helicopter, and that it has become the true eyes of the fleet. After the Korean War, S-51s, then serving in every branch of the United States military, continued their life-saving work. Coast Guard and Navy HO-3S crews hoisted stranded swimmers from the water. They also tracked down children lost in coastal brush and river deltas. The Air Force even used their H-5s to airlift pregnant women to hospitals. A few Americans were actually born on board mid-flight. Additionally, the H-5 regularly flew relief missions to Native American settlements in the western mountains. This happened during the Big Snow, a period of massive, destructive blizzards and avalanches. There are simply too many of these mercy missions carried out by Sikorsky's helicopters to count. It would take an entire volume to cover them all in detail. Looking at the bigger picture, over their first 30 years of operation, rescue helicopters worldwide evacuated more than 500,000 people to safety. By 1951, Igor Sikorsky's company had rolled out a total of 379 S-51s. 58 of these were built specifically for the civilian market. One day, the legendary designer walked up to the final production S-51 on the assembly line. He gently patted the tail boom like a farmer praising a trusty old horse. He affectionately said, "Go on, my friend, you have done your job well." Sikorsky stood deep in thought for a moment. Then he confidently walked over to the nose of the next helicopter coming down the line, the newer S-55. It was no coincidence that Igor Sikorsky gave the S-51 such a warm send-off. After all, this airframe did more for the global rotorcraft industry than anything else flying at the time. Produced by the hundreds over 5 years, it became one of the most famous and widely operated helicopters around the globe. The S-51 accomplished something absolutely crucial. It proved that this entirely new branch of aviation was viable and incredibly promising. The widespread recognition of its reliable, highly effective operations finally convinced the world that helicopters had a massive future ahead of them. When evaluating its successor, Dmitry Viner once noted that the S-55 turned out to be remarkably trouble-free. This exceptional reliability was made possible by extensive research programs. It was also driven by the priceless hands-on experience engineers gained from 5 years of heavy flight operations with the S-51. According to Viner, the S-55 did just as much for the development of the helicopter industry as the legendary DC-3 did for commercial airlines. The massive wave of orders for the S-51 brought in serious revenue. This allowed Igor Sikorsky to completely retool his factory in 1949. Speaking that same year, at a celebration marking the 10-year anniversary of the first flight of his famous VS-300, Sikorsky proudly made a statement. He said, "Looking back at the incredible progress we have made over our first decade, we have every reason to be completely satisfied with our work." By that point, the more than 600 helicopters he had produced had already logged a combined total of over 80,000 flight hours. Starting in 1947, the S-51 became a major export success. These helicopters could be seen flying in the skies over Australia, Argentina, Great Britain, Venezuela, the Netherlands, Egypt, Canada, Taiwan, and South Africa. Later on, the S-51 saw actual combat with the British military in Malaya, Cyprus, and Egypt. The French also operated them on a smaller scale during the First Indochina War. Interestingly, it was actually the purchase of an S-51 production license that kick-started full-rate helicopter manufacturing in the UK. Up until then, British engineers had been reluctant to accept Sikorsky's success. They were stubbornly trying to develop their own indigenous rotary-wing aircraft. They wanted to build something entirely original. They argued that the classic single-main rotor configuration introduced by Sikorsky was far from the only viable path forward for the helicopter industry. In 1951, the passenger variants of these helicopters successfully passed certification. They began rolling out to civilian operators in large numbers. Around the same time, export deliveries expanded to Italy, Japan, Thailand, and several other countries. Shortly after, they introduced dedicated medevac helicopters. To accommodate patients, these were fitted with spacious external litters. These litters were designed specifically for transporting stretchers. After that, the British aerospace company Westland launched full-scale production of a search and rescue variant called the Dragonfly. It was a major step up from its predecessors thanks to durable all-metal rotor blades and hydraulically boosted flight controls, which significantly reduced pilot workload. The Royal Navy immediately procured 58 of these helicopters. Another batch of slightly upgraded airframes followed soon after. On top of that, 12 medevac variants entered service with the Royal Air Force. In total, Westland built 140 Dragonfly series helicopters. Then, in 1955, the British built an additional 14 heavily upgraded WS-51 helicopters. These were designated the Widgeon. The aircraft stood out with a much larger 5-seat cabin. This finally allowed stretcher patients to be comfortably loaded directly inside the fuselage. They also featured longer rotor blades alongside a more modern and reliable main rotor hub. Additionally, they included a specialized external cargo hook. This hook was capable of lifting up to 1,000 pounds. It is safe to say that the highly pragmatic British managed to squeeze every ounce of potential out of the basic S-51 airframe.